They forced me to tear out the driveway I built with my own hands. So I made the man who ordered it pay thousands to tear out his. I never thought a few inches of concrete in front of my house would turn into a fight over power, pride, and who really gets to decide what happens in a neighborhood. But that was exactly what happened on Briarwood Lane. And looking back now, I still can't believe how something so small exposed everything that was wrong underneath. My name is Daniel Harper, and I've been pouring concrete for 23 years. I've worked on everything from small backyard patios to commercial foundations that had to hold up for decades. I know concrete the way some people know music. I can look at a surface, see a crack forming, and almost tell you what went wrong before I even touch it. So when the old driveway at my house started breaking apart after years of freezing winters and heavy rain, I didn't think twice about replacing it myself. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted a safe, clean driveway that would last. I removed the damaged concrete, rebuilt the base properly, checked the slope, added the right reinforcement, and finished it carefully. When I was done, I stood there in my front yard with a cup of coffee in my hand, looking at that smooth gray surface, and I remember thinking, yeah, this is going to outlast me. It was honestly the best-looking driveway on the entire street, and I wasn't saying that because it was mine. I said it because I knew what good work looked like. 2 weeks later, I opened my mailbox and found a letter from the Cedar Ridge Community Association. At first, I thought it was probably some reminder about trash cans or holiday decorations. That was normal in our neighborhood. Then, I read the first line, and my stomach dropped. Violation notice. Unauthorized exterior modification. Remove within 60 days. Fine, $3,000. The signature at the bottom was the part that bothered me the most. Gregory Whitmore, president of the HOA board. Gregory wasn't just another neighbor. He was the kind of person who walked around the neighborhood like he was inspecting a military base. He lived in the biggest house on the hill, a massive brick colonial with perfectly trimmed hedges and a driveway that looked like it belonged in a magazine. He liked reminding people that he protected the standards of the community, but everyone knew what that really meant. He liked being the person who said no. When I first moved into Briarwood Lane, Gregory made it clear he had opinions about everything: the color of my mailbox, the height of my fence, the type of plants I put near the walkway. Nothing was ever good enough. I never gave him a reason to dislike me, but I also never acted impressed by his position, and I think that bothered him more than anything. I didn't treat him like a neighborhood king. I treated him like a neighbor. And, apparently, that was a problem. I went to the HOA meeting expecting a conversation. I thought maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe they wanted paperwork. Maybe there was a box I missed checking. I walked into that room believing common sense would win. I was wrong. Gregory sat at the front table with a folder in front of him, almost like he had been waiting for this moment. He looked at me, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Mr. Harper, your driveway does not meet community standards." I asked him what specifically was wrong with it. He said the materials were not approved and the grading could create drainage issues. I looked around the room and waited for someone else to question that. Nobody did. So I asked the question that changed everything. "Can you show me the drainage report?" The room went quiet. Gregory paused for a second. Just a second, but I noticed it. He looked down at his papers and said, "A report isn't necessary. The board has determined there is a concern." I leaned back in my chair. "So you're telling me you're ordering me to remove a driveway because you think there might be a problem?" He didn't like that question. His face tightened. "We are protecting property values." I almost laughed because I had spent my whole career protecting structures, and I knew the difference between protecting something and controlling something. Then I asked about the material requirements. I wanted to see the official standard they claimed I violated. Gregory slid a document across the table. I read it carefully. It was barely a paragraph long, vague enough to mean almost anything. And then I noticed something strange. The wording sounded familiar, too familiar. Later that night, I looked through the HOA records and discovered something that made my jaw drop. The updated driveway standard had been written by Gregory himself months earlier. He had created the rule, interpreted the rule, and punished me under the rule. It wasn't about the driveway. It was about control. When I got home, my wife, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen table with the violation letter in one hand and our bank statement in the other. Our daughter had just started getting braces, and anyone who has ever raised a kid knows those bills don't exactly disappear. She looked exhausted, not angry, just tired. She asked me the question I didn't want to answer. "Daniel, is this really the battle we want to fight?" I looked at that letter again. $3,000? 60 days. Tear out something I built correctly because one man decided he didn't like it. That night I barely slept. I thought about paying the fine. I thought about apologizing. I thought about just letting it go because sometimes peace feels cheaper than justice. But then I kept thinking about one thing. I knew every driveway on that street. I knew what was underneath them. I knew which ones were built right and which ones were just pretty on the surface. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. If Gregory Whitmore wanted to talk about standards, maybe it was time someone checked whether he was following his own. The next morning, instead of calling Gregory, instead of arguing with the HOA board again, I grabbed a notebook, put on my work boots, and started walking around Briarwood Lane. I wasn't looking for revenge. At least that's what I told myself. I was looking for facts. There is a big difference between being angry and being right. And after 23 years in construction, I had learned that feelings don't hold buildings together. Measurements do. Evidence does. Reality does. I started with my own driveway first, checking everything I had done. The base depth was correct. The slope was within acceptable limits. Water was moving exactly where it was supposed to move. The more I checked my own work, the more confident I became that Gregory's violation wasn't based on a real concern. It was based on an opinion. Then I started looking at the rest of the neighborhood. I walked past homes I had driven by hundreds of times without ever paying attention. Funny how you start seeing things differently when someone challenges your expertise. I noticed small details most people would never think about. Cracks that showed poor preparation. Water stains where drainage had failed. Driveways that looked perfect from the street but had problems underneath. And then I reached the top of the hill. Gregory Whitmore's house. The grand entrance. The perfectly trimmed bushes. The driveway he proudly showed off during neighborhood events. The same driveway he probably thought nobody would ever question. I stood there for a few minutes just looking at it, and honestly, I almost walked away. Because there is something uncomfortable about challenging someone who has spent years convincing everyone they are the authority. But then I noticed the first problem. There were no expansion joints where there should have been. For someone who claimed to care about standards, that was a pretty obvious mistake. I looked closer. The slope was wrong. Water from his driveway wasn't moving toward the street drainage system. It was flowing toward 3 neighboring properties. Then I noticed something even more concerning. The concrete had been poured over a poorly prepared surface. No proper compacted base. Just a shortcut hidden under an expensive-looking finish. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who accused me of lowering property standards had built one of the biggest examples of poor workmanship in the neighborhood. But I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew something important. If I handled this emotionally, Gregory would win. He would tell everyone I was just a bitter homeowner trying to get revenge. So I did what I always do when there is a problem with concrete. I went back to the foundation. I collected records. I reviewed county regulations. I looked at the actual stormwater requirements, not Gregory's homemade version of the rules. And that's when I found the difference between HOA rules and real regulations. HOA rules could be written by people with opinions. County codes were written because engineers had studied problems for years. There was no comparison. I filed a complaint with the county stormwater department. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't post about it online. I didn't walk around bragging. I just submitted the information and waited. A few days later, an inspector named Carla Reynolds showed up at my house. She was professional, calm, and clearly not interested in neighborhood politics. She looked at my driveway first. She measured everything. She checked the drainage path. She reviewed my paperwork. Then she smiled and said, "Honestly, Mr. Harper, this is one of the cleaner residential driveway replacements I've seen." That was the first time in weeks I felt like someone was actually looking at the facts. Then she went to Gregory's property. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I knew what she would find. 2 days later, I received a call from the county office. The inspector had completed her review. Gregory Whitmore's driveway had multiple drainage violations. The county issued him a correction order and a $7,500 fine. He had 90 days to fix the issue or face additional penalties. When I read that letter, I didn't feel the excitement I expected. I didn't jump around. I didn't laugh. I just sat there quietly. Because suddenly, this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about realizing how far things had gone. Gregory had spent months acting like he was protecting the neighborhood, but now the official inspectors were telling him that his own property was creating the exact kind of problem he accused me of causing. And of course, Gregory didn't take it quietly. He called an emergency HOA meeting. I walked in and immediately knew the mood was different. People weren't looking at me like I was the problem anymore. They were looking at Gregory. He stood at the front of the room, angry and defensive. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "The county doesn't understand our community standards." I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. The same man who told me community standards mattered more than everything else was now saying official standards didn't matter because they disagreed with him. Then Mike Callahan, one of the board members, finally spoke up. Mike had been on the HOA board for 2 years. He had voted against my original violation, but Gregory had enough support to push it through anyway. Mike looked at Gregory and said, "Greg, maybe we need to stop pretending every disagreement is an attack on the community." You could feel the room change. That was the first crack in Gregory's control. Later that week, Mike came by my house. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. He told me he knew the driveway violation wasn't right from the beginning, but didn't want to become the target. I understood. Most people don't like conflict. They see something wrong, but they convince themselves it's easier to stay quiet. I told him, standing up after it's safe isn't the same as standing up when it matters. He nodded because he knew I was right. Mike offered to testify during my appeal hearing. That meant more to me than the fine being removed, because after weeks of feeling like I was standing alone, someone finally admitted what happened wasn't fair. Meanwhile, Gregory made one last mistake. He tried to use HOA funds to cover the repairs on his driveway. He claimed it was a community drainage issue and therefore a community expense. But the HOA bylaws were very clear. Private property repairs were the responsibility of the homeowner. When the board rejected his request, Gregory was forced to pay out of his own pocket. The final bill was estimated at nearly $20,000 after the drainage correction, removal, and replacement work. For the first time since I met him, Gregory had to deal with the same frustration he had handed to someone else. But the biggest fight was still ahead, my appeal hearing. Because even though the county approved my driveway was fine, I still had to fight the HOA violation itself. The hearing date arrived on a cold Thursday evening. I walked into that room carrying a folder full of documents. Photos, measurements, regulations, everything. Gregory sat across from me, still trying to look confident, but something had changed. For the first time, he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone who realized the rules he created were no longer protecting him. I presented my case calmly. I didn't insult him. I didn't attack his character. I simply showed the facts. There was no approved material violation. There was no drainage study. There was no evidence that my driveway created any problem. The violation existed because one person decided it should. After listening to everything, the review committee made their decision. My violation was dismissed. The $3,000 fine was removed. My driveway stayed exactly where it was. For months, I had imagined that moment feeling like a victory parade, but when it finally happened, all I felt was relief, because I realized something. Sometimes justice doesn't feel like fireworks. Sometimes it just feels like finally being able to breathe again. But winning the argument didn't mean everything went back to normal. In some ways, the hardest part was just beginning. When the appeal decision finally came down, I thought the story was over. I thought once the paperwork proved the truth, once the official decision showed that my driveway wasn't the problem, everything would settle down and we could all move forward. But life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you can win the argument and still feel like you lost something along the way. The strange thing about Briarwood Lane was that nothing looked different after everything happened. The houses were still there. The lawns were still perfectly trimmed. People still drove the same streets every morning, but the feeling was gone. The easy conversations, the casual waves, the sense that everyone was on the same team, that disappeared quietly. Some neighbors came up to me privately and told me they knew I was right. They said they had seen what Gregory was doing for years. They said they were glad someone finally challenged him. But almost every one of them followed it with the same sentence: "I just didn't want to get involved." And I understood that. Fear has a strange way of keeping people silent. The hardest part wasn't what Gregory said about me. It wasn't the meetings or the accusations. It was seeing how it affected my family. One evening, my daughter Olivia came home upset after hearing another kid say our family was the reason there was drama in the neighborhood. She looked at me and asked, "Dad, did we really do something wrong?" I remember sitting there trying to find the right words, because no father wants his child carrying the weight of an adult conflict. I told her that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't mean everyone will understand it. Sometimes people get uncomfortable when someone refuses to stay quiet. But after she went to bed, I sat alone and wondered if there was a better way I could have handled everything. Maybe I should have just paid the fine. Maybe I should have ignored Gregory and moved on. Because the truth is, nobody tells you about this part. Nobody tells you that standing up for yourself can still hurt. Emily stopped attending the neighborhood gatherings after that. She told me she didn't want to spend her evenings pretending everything was normal when it wasn't. She missed the friendship she thought she had, and honestly, I missed them too. A few months later, Gregory finally put his house on the market. The man who spent years telling everyone how to maintain their homes was leaving the neighborhood he claimed to protect. I expected to feel satisfaction when I saw the moving truck arrive. I expected to feel like I had won. But instead, I just felt tired. Because by then I understood that this was never really about a driveway. It was about what happens when someone confuses authority with respect. After Gregory left, the new homeowner, a man named Robert Miller, came over and introduced himself. The first thing he asked wasn't about HOA rules or neighborhood politics. He asked if I knew someone who could build a patio. I laughed and told him I might know a guy. He smiled and said, "I heard you're the best concrete guy around here." That simple sentence meant more than he probably realized. For months, people had looked at me like I was the problem. Robert looked at me like I was just a person who did good work. While I was finishing his patio, he said something I'll never forget. Funny how people spend so much time protecting a neighborhood that they forget the neighborhood is made of people. And he was right. Rules matter. Communities need standards. But standards without fairness become control. Real codes don't care who lives on the hill. They don't care who has the biggest house or the loudest voice. They only care about what is right. My driveway is still there today, stronger than ever. And every time I pull into it, I remember that sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it simply comes from knowing you stood your ground when it mattered. So I want to ask you, if you were in my position, would you have fought back or just paid the fine to keep the peace? Was Gregory protecting the neighborhood, or was he protecting his own power? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because these situations happen everywhere, and the line between rules and control is not always easy to see. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people standing up against unfair treatment, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes that the truth eventually catches up with everyone.